Hello, I'm Charles Mallet with a UK Column interview, notes for which will be posted at ukcolumn.org. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by Clare Wills-Harrison, who has made a career in law that has resulted in her highlighting and exposing the various tyrannies of the state, in particular since 2020. Clare, a very warm welcome to UK Column. Thank you very much indeed for joining me.
Thank you for having me.
Not at all.
Nice to be here.
Good, and we'll look forward to going through, I think, a considerable amount of material. But just to set the context for the audience, please describe what it was that drew you into law in the first place and what you had in mind in terms of a career path, where you thought that was going to take you and how life in law, as it were, would work out.
So I'm going to be really honest here and say that I had a passion for watching really bad 80s law dramas with big shoulder pads and women that were very dynamic and setting the world to rights. That was one of my inspirations. Sadly, however, my dad actually passed away when I was 25, and his estate wasn't dealt with particularly well, and it was particularly difficult for myself and my siblings. And I think, as with a lot of people, I decided that I would go into the law and I would work particularly in succession, which is what I've done for 25 years, because I never wanted anybody else to experience what my family had experienced when my father died. And I was just partway through my exams, actually, when he passed away. In the lead up to his death, things had been difficult, and I touched on looking at perhaps becoming legally qualified for other reasons. But once he passed away, my mind was made up that that's what I was going to do. And that's really why I went into law, for no other reason, I'm ashamed to say, than that.
Well, I don't think there's anything to be ashamed of at all. But tell me, therefore, about the training, and just cast your mind back to how, when you went through that period, how, if at all, how law was sort of cast as fitting into the overall architecture of organisation of the country.
I've been a lawyer for 25 years, so I started my studying obviously before that. So for the qualifying period tags on a few more years. I'm showing my age now. But we were always taught, when I was studying, that law provides a framework of rules and regulations that help to govern human behaviour and interactions in a community. It's supposed to reflect the values, the norms, the customs of a particular society at any particular given time. It helps to maintain order by resolving disputes, promoting fairness, justice, and that law and society obviously share an intricate and reciprocal relationship. Legal systems are deeply embedded in the foundations of societal structures. There's an interplay between law and society because it reflects cultural values, historical context, and the evolving tapestry of societal norms. So that's the foundation that I was taught for learning about law, that it's deeply intertwined with human behaviour and society. Of course, there's a whole body of historical rules and context that go along with that. But it isn't as dry as reading a book and this rule is this and that rule is that. There's a body of context that goes around that.
And from the description you've just given as to sort of where the legal system effectively fits in, did you see that was in large part how things played out certainly for the earlier part of your career? Was your faith in the system well placed?
Well, I have to say, looking back now, I don't think it was, but at the time, I think if you believe in something and if you're taught enough and in a certain way, that what is right and how things should be, you end up believing it. I have to say now at the end of my career, I look back and I don't really feel that the law itself serves the function which it is supposed to, which is a protective function to resolve disputes between individuals or individuals and the state. Unfortunately, I'm now in the position that I look at the law as a weapon, as a sword rather than a shield.
Very well put. It's a very interesting phrase. Now, I mentioned in the introduction that the sort of exposing, as I say, of the state that you've been doing, particularly since 2020, has been very notable, and I'm sure many of the audience will be very much aware of your work on that score. Prior to 2020, was that a point of view that you had come to, the as you say, the weaponisation? And were there any sort of examples that you can bring to mind?
Yes, I started to have very real concerns actually in some of the procedure that we were having to go through within the legal system. And this really came to the forefront with, some people might be surprised to hear this, the anti-money laundering regulations that were brought in. I'm going back quite some time now. I think probably 2006 or 2007, it started to become necessary that we as lawyers were to run identity checks on our clients to make sure that they were not hardened criminals, I guess, or terrorists or into money laundering. And initially that involved taking their identification documents, which at that point you could do in paper form. So you could take somebody's passport, copy of somebody's passport, copy of somebody's driving license. And as long as you were not aware that they were into criminal activity that involved money laundering, you had satisfied your duties with regards to checking their identity. And I couldn't understand at that time why, although there were certain exemptions in certain areas of law that you didn't have to take that identity for, because they were nuanced, it became the norm to just take people's identity for every area that you were dealing with. And I couldn't understand at the time why we had been tasked with essentially trying to find out who was a criminal, because in my opinion, that was the job of the police and not of lawyers. So I became concerned about how the legal system, rather than the law and the framework, the people that make up that system, were being tasked to be perhaps something more than just acting for their clients in settling disputes or guiding them through a procedure when somebody had died, or the myriad of other things that lawyers do. So I started to become a little bit disenfranchised with that kind of things and that kind of thing. And of course, it developed and grew legs. And since 2006, 2007, it's expanded greatly, so that we're in the position now that when we have a client that comes to us and wants us to do any work for them, our first thought has to be, is this person a criminal? And I don't think that's right. So we now have to assess whether we have to do a risk assessment, and we have to ask ourselves all sorts of questions. Is this client local? Why are they coming to me if they're not local? Are they involved in any criminal activity? Where have they got their money from? If you're dealing with something that involves talking about their money, which is frequent in my area of law. Are they a politically exposed person? Are they on a sanctions list? Now, when you check somebody's identity, it's really not just a question of taking their paper documents, because we have to check if they're on a PEP list. We have to check if they're on a sanctions list. And unfortunately, because that involves looking at several different things to find all of that out and make a record of it. Systems have, of course, developed where you have companies that will do an identity check and all of that for you online electronically. And it's vastly cheaper and vastly quicker. And therefore, there's a lot of data going through these companies that ticks off your requirements for the anti-money laundering legislation. We're obviously obliged to make suspicious activity reports if we think that our clients are into anything odd. And that might not be that we think that they're money laundering. It might just be that we can't tick off a box on our risk assessment that covers us because it's a personal liability. And then, of course, we've now got proliferation financing that we have to consider. Is anybody into the sale or the procurement of nuclear or biological or chemical weapons? We've got all sorts of sanctions lists where we can't act for anyone who's from Russia or anywhere else. And this is against the backdrop, of course, of what our own government is involved in financing conflicts and financing weapon sales in the Middle East, when we have to ask ourselves, are they complicit in potentially genocide? So the disenfranchisement set in quite a long time ago with the odd things that we were having to do, as I said, with post 9/11, really. I think that the anti-money laundering and the terrorist financing, all those kind of regulations really took hold. It wasn't something that we first did when I started as a lawyer. We didn't take anybody's identification documents. You met with somebody, you treated them at their word, and you used your own instinct as to whether there was something odd going on. I have to say, latterly, in my profession, I think in my job, I think the profession as a whole has just become one big mess of supporting government policy and lawyers being afraid to speak out and take on certain cases. And, we can talk about some examples of that have been in the news recently. I think we're over-regulated. I think that the regulatory framework is not fit for purpose to a large degree. It's there, I think, to punish lawyers, the low-hanging fruit, certainly, rather than make lawyers do a good job. And I think you'll recall yesterday I sent you something about SRA fines, where they're paid to, and their increased fining powers, and it all seems very murky and interwoven with the state, I'm afraid.
It does, and I think that's going to provide amazing context for the audience to think that this, what you're describing started nearly 20 years ago, and when we consider now the way in which, exactly like you describe, identity, surveillance, the holding of data the holding and management of data by sort of third-party entities has become, for ill, I would say, part and parcel of life now. It was when that did start, and as you say, it sort of seems to have just snowballed over the years. Was there a particular directive issued that grew organically, or were law firms instructed that they had to do this, then they had to do that? Were they effectively, we saw this during the COVID years, people just gold plating something that had started as this and they'd made more of it? Do you remember, how did it actually start?
So with the anti-money laundering regulations, that was an EU directive, if I remember rightly. I think you'd have to go, I think as far back as 1994, I was having a look a couple of days ago at this particular point, there was some kind of regulatory framework in the UK for anti-money laundering. As I said, it really started to bite, and around about 2006, and I'm sure that was from an EU directive. If you look at the latest iteration of the anti-money laundering regulations, it's the anti-money laundering and terrorist financing, I think, regulations I think it might be, I could be wrong, it might be 2017. I could be wrong there, and I should know actually. But they seem to have sprung out of EU policy making, and of course, then we had Brexit. But we're still very closely aligned to those sorts of things. Any time there's a directive that comes out of the EU, there's matching legislation or regulations in this country. It's also closely aligned to US policy on that kind of thing, and it's a Western thing. I would think.
Yes, well, I mean, again, to hear that it's the EU that crops up in this area will, I think, not be a great surprise to the audience. But again, just confirmation that all the suspicions that we have about these supranational organisations are absolutely well-founded. Now, you were talking about law effectively moving into a situation where it was supporting government policy. And I mean, I think I might be right in saying that no more clearly was that seen than in 2020. But from your perspective, how did that manifest? How did it change? I mean, how did it sort of come about, and what was your reaction to it?
So are you talking about from 2020, how I mean, because it really was it really was like being hit with a sledgehammer from there. There might have been a creep, over the years up to that point that perhaps you wouldn't notice. It was probably rather insidious. But from 2020 onwards, I think we only have to go back. If we go back right to the beginning, I don't really like going back to the beginning of 2020. But if we do go back to the beginning, let's go back to January, say, when we were first hearing various things around the world connected to so-called COVID, and we were watching other countries put in a system of rules, lockdown, something I'd never heard in my life aside from in prisons. It's what you do to people that are in prisons. You lock them down. You don't do that to people that are not criminals. I remember actually, perhaps I won't mention any names, but I had a client that worked for DEFRA actually that came in to see me in, I think it was February 2020. And he said to me, it was after Italy had gone into a lockdown. I know that, so I can't remember exactly when that was, but he came in to see me about something completely unrelated. And he said to me, of course, we're going to go into lockdown. I said, what do you mean? How can you know that? So he worked for DEFRA. So I took from that, perhaps wrongly, that it must have been circulating within government departments and agencies that there was a plan to put us into lockdown. It was already known. Now, of course, that didn't happen until March 2020, actually, the day after my birthday. So it's one that I can never forget. And it was odd because after he had mentioned that to me, I started to notice, and perhaps it's like the old saying, what you focus on, you notice everywhere. If you say I haven't seen a red car for ages, you see 10. But I started to notice in legal publications and other bits that you're looking at in the industry that there was this kind of soft inference that things were going to change, that and that there would have to be legislation brought in to support that, and I thought, this is odd. Like, why is there no articles that are questioning the sense of it, or saying, shouldn't we wait to see how, lockdown worked out in Italy before we go and lock down in England? It was all very much I mean, I've come to realise, sadly, the legal press is just as bad as the mainstream media. They're only going to publish what is supportive of the narrative, of the day generally. And I thought this doesn't look good, because there's nobody in the industry that I can see that is posting anything or writing any articles saying what an absolute disaster it would be if we lock people up in care homes, particularly because that's one area that I focus on in my job. And indeed, if we just lock people in their homes, and also what's it going to do to the economy? It was all geared from, this is an absolute disaster. It's the worst scary thing that's ever happened to us, and we're all going to have to stay indoors no matter what the consequences of it are. And I thought, this is not good, because if the legal profession or the legal system cannot speak out about why that would not be a good thing, and why we need some balance, and why we need some nuance here, we don't stand a chance. And of course, we then had Lord Sumption that did come out and say a number of things, but of course he wasn't, at the time, involved in actually hearing cases or anything like that. And we had very few lawyers speaking out as well. And I thought, as I say, I thought to myself, this is not good. The whole of the legal profession, I have to say, and the system itself became paralysed, absolutely paralysed by fear. Absolutely. I know of no other solicitors firm in my local area that stayed open, aside from myself. Not one.
That is absolutely staggering. And it brings us on to something that you were, as I said at the beginning, very outspoken about, but you've talked about care homes. Just sort of fill in the blanks, really, in terms of what did happen. I mean, in a sense, we know, but I'm thinking about it, through your legal lens. Care homes, but also the DNR notices situation and the use of midazolam. I think that those would be the sort of the three areas that it would be fascinating to hear your insight into.
So let's talk about specifically care homes first. I'm just going to jot down what you asked me, because I have a terrible habit of forgetting. So you want DNRs and obviously midazolam. But let's talk about care homes first of all. And let's just remind all your viewers that the people in care homes are, of course, some of the most vulnerable people in society. They're in a care home because they cannot look after themselves generally anymore. Very few go into a care home just because they can't be bothered and they don't want to live at home anymore. Some do, but very few. So they're some of our most vulnerable citizens in society. So right at the beginning, before we went into lockdown in March, I actually was dealing with one of my clients, and she was in hospital, and she was due to be discharged into a care home because she couldn't look after herself anymore. Now, she was fit for discharge. She'd been in hospital for something that she'd recovered from. And this was probably only 3 or 4 days before lockdown. There were no masks in hospitals. There was none. There were people milling about. There were people visiting still, obviously, the scary virus only hit on the 23rd at 9 o'clock in the morning. It wasn't floating about before then. So, but let's just, so she was due to be discharged into a care home, and I was able to get into a hospital, and we were able to sort that out. So everything was normal, and hospitals and care homes were functioning normally. Now, when I was in the hospital visiting my client, as anyone will know if they go into a hospital to visit or to see clients, most of the people in a hospital are ill. They're very ill. They're in there for a reason. A lot of them are old, or if they're not old, they're obviously significantly unwell. That's why they're in hospital. But if we go back right to the beginning of lockdown, what people need to remember is that all of the old people in hospital that were in there for a reason, they hadn't been discharged like my client that was fit for discharge. They were in there because they were unwell. They were all turfed out of hospitals into care homes. So they went from an environment that was treating them for an illness, that had appropriate people that could give them care, appropriate drugs, appropriate equipment, emergency equipment if necessary. They went from that environment into a care home, which is not, into a residential home lots of times, which is not the appropriate place for somebody that is very unwell to go to. Now, once they got there, they were not allowed back into hospitals. If they became ill after lockdown, there are many, many reports, and you only have to go and watch the Scottish COVID inquiry for proof of this. And I spoke about this in April 2020 because I was deeply concerned for my own clients. If these people became unwell, which would be no surprise to me given they were in hospital because they were ill and then put into back into a residential home that doesn't have the right equipment and staff to deal with those kind of illnesses. If these people deteriorated and ambulances were called, those ambulances were told, the people that called them were told that the ambulances would not take these elderly people to hospital. We called it a do not admit to hospital. They had do not admit to hospital orders. And this was all part of, we later found out, the frailty scores that were issued. I have to say, we don't even know to this day from where they originated from, but they filtered down through, the various NHS bodies and care homes, and hospitals may have came to the home, but they would not take, in many instances, they would not take these people to hospital. So we have to remember that happened. Okay. Then we have to remember that these residents were locked away from their families. And in many cases, anyone that has a relative in a care home will know that the family provide crucial oversight for lots of things, especially feeding, because there are residents that are suffering from perhaps Alzheimer's or dementias, forget to eat. It it frequently happens, and care staff are thin on the ground and they don't have the time to feed residents. And so family members go in and they take nice food and they feed their loved one, and it's part of their visiting ritual and caring ritual that they have. That was all taken away. We had one lady that starved, Rosemary Riemann, the Rosemary Riemann case. She starved to death in a care home. It's abhorrent. Her husband even tried to get a job working in the care home so that he could feed her. So in addition to that, we had the complete withdrawal of all support services. So we had no physiotherapists, we had no chiropodists, we had no hairdressers. All of those make up not only the culture of a care home, but the necessary support that is needed to be given to residents that are in a care home. We also didn't have, in many, many cases, in-house GP visits anymore. We had them all done by Zoom. Okay, so everything has been taken away from the most vulnerable in society. No support services, no family oversight, no GP visits. So that's what happened in care homes. And of course, the end result of that, it doesn't take a genius to work out what it's going to be. People are going to get very ill. People are going to become frail. This was at a time when you had care home staff, if they had a sniffle, were told to isolate for 14 days. Okay, and they did. So you had staffing crises. You had homes, like I said, that were made to take people out of hospital and were told that they wouldn't get their local authority funding for the beds in the care home if they didn't take people. They didn't want to actually take people because it was going to place more of a burden on them given staffing levels. And they also had concerns themselves about who they were taking from hospital, what these people might have wrong with them, could they service them and look after them properly. All, I think, pretty standard, normal things that you would think about and that you would, we can't fault them for thinking those things. So it was a horrible, horrible, horrible situation. And I wrote some figures down, which I'll just turn my head to read to you. From the 2nd of March 2020 to the 12th of June 2020, there were 28,186 excess deaths in care homes. That's a 46% increase on previous years. Now, 18,000 of them, of those excess deaths, were classed as with COVID. And I could talk a lot about that because I think we all know by now what that means. Okay, that doesn't even mean a positive test, because it means that you could say it if you suspected it. But if we accept, okay, I don't, but if we did accept that 18,000 of them were with COVID, would anybody like to tell me what the other 10,000 excess deaths were from then? And here I think we come into the realms of the DNRs and the end of life, inappropriate end of life medication. And the fact of the matter is, this is a real issue. This has been covered in the Scottish COVID inquiry, and I would recommend anybody to go and have a look at that inquiry. I know that your presenter, I think, is it Diane, has started having a look at this, and there is Dave Biology, his Substack, has done an awful lot of work on it. It's absolutely shocking, and it covers everything that I spoke about in April 2020. There is, of course, a complete media blackout on it, mainstream media. It's not covered at all. I think it's probably one of the biggest tragedies of our time, what happened in care homes. And unfortunately, having lived through the post office scandal and moaned about for years and years and years how wrong it, what had gone on, and then to see a series made on ITV and then everybody be up in arms about it, I know from the bottom of my heart that this issue will never, ever get into public consciousness unless somebody makes a mainstream television programme about it, and that is never going to happen. The fact of the matter is that the UK government ordered 2 years' worth of midazolam. We could say that would be sensible if they thought that there was a pandemic coming and they didn't want people to die in agony. We know, however, from prescribing information, that most of that went into the community and not into hospitals. So it wasn't used for people on ventilators to sedate them. It was used in a setting, really, where it was inappropriate for inappropriate reasons. Now, we haven't got time to go into individual cases and to talk about the minutiae of why it might have been inappropriate and how we can show that. But what people need to know is that there are actually many, many, many thousands of families that have been affected by this, that have had relatives affected by this.
Sorry, I should have actually said DNR, meaning do not resuscitate.
Yes.
Side of it, just give the background to that and sort of how that relates to what I'm right in saying is referred to as subcapacity and the sort of wishes expressed by the individual and that, how that was just completely sort of bastardized.
So, yes, a DNR does mean do not resuscitate, and it's also called a DNA CPR, that they both mean the same things. And actually what it really means is if my heart stops, don't restart it, okay? That's what it means. Now, generally, you would choose or consent to a DNR because it's part of your right to life. human right to life. So, and lots of people do have them. Lots of people, for their own reasons, choose that if their heart stops, they do not want to be resuscitated. Now, I think it's probably widely known that it's all too common that DNRs are confused by the medical profession, if you like, and carers, that once they see a DNR, that they think it means that you don't give somebody adequate treatment anymore, when, like I've said, it just simply means if my heart stops, do not restart it. But it's often used as a synonym for, this person's end of life if they've got a DNR. That's not what it's supposed to be about. Now we know, and it's been widely publicised, that people had DNRs cropping up on their records at care homes, on their records, medical records at doctors, that had been put there without their consent. So they had never been asked, would you like a DNR? This is what it is, and this is what it means. That one was just appeared on their notes and their records. We also know that there was a process where supposedly some people did agree, but those people didn't have the mental capacity to be able to consent to a DNR. So therefore, it should have gone through what we call the best interest procedure, and there should have been a consultation with that person's nearest living next of kin and family and whoever else was involved with that person, because that's what the best interest procedure demands. None of that happened, and DNRs ended up on the records of people that didn't have the capacity to consent to them, as well as people that did have the capacity to consent to them but just had never consented. And we it was a blanket issue. We spoke a lot about blanket DNRs, and it was recognised, of course, by Mr. Matthew Hancock, who at first denied it, but of course later on had to come out and say, when we found out that it was happening, we issued a directive that it shouldn't happen. Well, I want to know why it was happening in the first place. Did somebody wake up one day and just decide at all of these care homes and doctors then that they were going to do this? I don't think so. There must have been a directive. And of course, they're incredibly difficult to get off once they're on your records. Incredibly difficult. And like I said, the sad thing is, it should mean if my heart stops, don't restart it. But more often than not, they're used as justification for withdrawing treatment and for not continuing treatment, and for them putting people onto what we call end of life treatment. And how do you know someone's at the end of their life? I would say it's probably extremely difficult, even for the most advanced doctor, to be able to tell when somebody is in the last kind of couple of days of their life. And yet we saw this medication a lot of times. Actually, unfortunately, I'm aware that midazolam was given as a sedation to keep residents from wandering and keep them in their rooms because there just wasn't staff.
It's a very grim picture that you've sort of painted for us all over again. Very necessary to bring it out, but unfortunate nonetheless that we have to sort of go into it again. Now, you talked about the legal profession being paralysed with fear, and I think it's very hard to describe in any other way what happened with the legal profession and indeed the medical profession as being anything other than a conspiracy, certainly with regard to what you've just described and the treatment of people with the issues surrounding capacity and consent and all of that. Now, that brings us on to the way things should work, and I'm just going to read from the Supreme Court about the separation of powers, because this, of course, is the macro side of things. The doctrine of the separation of powers requires that the principal institutions of state, executive, legislature, and judiciary, should be clearly divided in order to safeguard citizens' liberties and guard against tyranny. Well, what do you think about that?
I think it's an absolute nonsense, and I think that the separation of powers hasn't existed for a long time, if it ever did at all. I mean, it's funny that you have read that out, actually, because disclosure, to your audience, I asked what you might want to talk about. One of the things that you mentioned was this kind of thing before we arranged this, and I thought I would go and do a little exercise by going onto the internet and having a look at some very basic questions. And I would really recommend your viewers do this, because I think they'll be staggered at what comes up. So I went on and I typed in, what is government? Very simple. What is a government? Okay, what is the UK government? What is the government to the people? Those kind of things. And you will be hit with on the first page, if you type in what is the government, what is the UK government, with, and I kid you not, the UK government is the Prime Minister and his cabinet. Now, just to touch on what you've just said about the separation of powers, okay, and government itself, because let's just talk about what government should be so that we know what government isn't. So government is just a word for a system, okay, to govern a nation or a state. I actually looked up a definition from the Columbia Encyclopedia, which defines government as a system of social control under which the right to make laws and the right to enforce them is vested in a particular group in society. I added a couple of lines onto this myself that said these rights, however, arise by virtue of the people, of a nation or state. And they arise by those people relinquishing some of their own power to a governing body. So it follows, I think, from that governments have obligations to their citizens, and as the power vested in governments is by the people for the people, that governments have limited power over their citizens for a limited time. Okay, so I think that's a better definition of what a government should be. They arose and came along, of course, because individuals of a nation saw the benefits, if you like, of having a body to look after things, okay? And we agreed to relinquish some of our rights to that external authority for that reason. It forms part of what we call the social contract, essentially, okay? So we agreed to relinquish certain rights, and in return, we're going to get protection from physical harm, supposedly. We're going to get security for our possessions. We're going to get security for our persons, we're going to have safe borders, and we're not going to be invaded by an aggressor, and we're going to be able to interact and cooperate with other humans in a stable, fair, peaceful environment. Okay, that's essentially what forms part of the social contract. And of course, government in the UK is made up of the three branches of government. It is not the Prime Minister and his cabinet. It is what we call the legislature, the executive and the judiciary, and they are supposed to be distinct and separate under the separation of powers, and they're supposed to each hold each other to account so that one of them doesn't become tyrannical and run away. I think, when some of the top judges play golf with the cabinet member's husband or wife, or the top police officer perhaps hobnobs with the top judge down at the same country club, and then we have solicitors that go on to become MPs, or judges that get involved in the executive branch. I think we can see that there really isn't any separation of powers. Let's be honest, okay? Let's be honest here, and this isn't a few bad apples. We can come at the. I kind of thought about the questions you asked me, and I thought we can come at this from the premise that it's just a few bad apples, and therefore we can fix this by having a more robust interpretation of the separation of powers, and making sure, that it's very defined and it's adhered to. But this is not a few bad apples. What we have is a political system now that is bought and paid for. And that's the crux of it. And it is bought and paid for by people that are already very powerful and have a lot of money and have a vested interest in policy and laws being made that supports their money and their power. And doesn't really support the vast majority of people. In fact, it makes their lives rather miserable and difficult. And that is, I think, how policy gets made, how laws get made in this country now. And I think, unfortunately for us, the judiciary follows policy and interpretation of those laws. I mean, the legislature, if it gets to make law through primary legislation, is quite, it's quite rare now because we're governed by statutory instruments. In 2020, there were 1,619 pieces of secondary legislation. That is legislation made by the executive, which is why, because it's written by a minister, which is why it can be judicially reviewed. Primary legislation supposedly goes through the parliamentary process. It's a bill introduced, it goes through the House of Commons, it goes through the House of Lords, it gets amended loads of times. It takes a long time, and it's actually not liked by people that want to bring in draconian laws because it takes too long and too many people read it and say that doesn't seem right, we need to take that out. So I think we're going to see the flexing of statutory instruments with amendments to the online safety bill, if I'm honest with you. I don't think there'll be new primary legislation for that. I think it will be brought in by secondary legislation, written up and signed off by a minister. And, if that is not being governed by the executive, I don't know what is. As I said, it's not a few bad apples, so it doesn't really matter. So if we did, it does matter, but if we did away with the statutory instruments, we still wouldn't have a system that is fairly representing the wishes and the rights of the people that it has been elected by, because we do employ them and pay them as well. It still wouldn't be right because it's subject to external influences. And I'm talking about, of course, all sorts of supranational national groups, clubs, if you want to, I call them, old men, rich men's clubs, but they're extremely dangerous. We're looking at all sorts of things. We're looking at the World Economic Forum. We're looking at the trilateral commissions. We're looking at, we're looking at the UN. We're looking at it. Our political system is subject to the whims and the policy decisions of those institutions, I'm afraid, to a large degree. And of course, we then also have lobbying from external influences, foreign countries. It's a complete mess.
That's a fitting description, and you're quite right to bring out all those examples. The social contract is broken. People have, I think, by and large, felt a sense of powerlessness and hopelessness, but they shouldn't necessarily, or not without qualification. And this is the next bit I want to ask you about, because you have effectively taken a stand. You have adopted a policy with which this can be dealt with, and we're talking about the financial sort of aspect of it, or at least part of that relationship, particularly concerning tax. So just give a background into the idea of tax resistance and what exactly that means, and how you've come to be sort of where you are with it.
Well, of course, tax resistance, and particularly war tax resistance, is as old as tax is. It's been around forever. If you do a quick search on the numerous tax resistance efforts that there have been, you will be confronted with many. Now, of course, it is tied up with a social contract, and it is tied up with, as we spoke about before, what government is and why it was if you like, why people agree to have a governing body and relinquish some of their rights for all of those benefits that they foresaw. And in doing so, they realised that that would cost money, of course, and that's supposedly what we pay part of our taxes for. So tax resistance has been around for a long time. Some of it has been violent, and I don't advocate for violence in any way, shape or form over anything. I'm anti-violence completely. And I believe that in the long run, peaceful non-compliance will win the day. And tax resistance is, of course, one of those methods, but it's not without its dangers for people, because not paying your taxes in this country is, of course, an offence that you will be punished for. So when I speak about this with people, I'm reticent to ever say to somebody, you should just stop paying all of your tax, because people really need to understand that they could get themselves into quite a lot of difficulty from doing that they may be unprepared for. And I don't want people to be in a situation where they're then grasping to or they're facing some kind of court action that they can't afford to get advice on, and it's made their life completely miserable. Okay, so I just want to caveat what I'm saying with that. Each person has to make a decision themselves about how far they are willing to go with anything. Now, I'm unsure if UK Column interviewed the chap, and I can't remember his name. I'm ever so sorry, that runs the probity website. Off the top of my head, can't remember his name. He's the guy that has of course said that he's not refusing to pay his taxes. He just doesn't want to pay taxes that fund any part of war or the military. The military complex, and he'll therefore agree to pay his taxes if he gets confirmation from HMRC as to what part or what they're going to use his money for. And until then, he's going to hold it somewhere for them. So it's a conditional offer to pay. I have to say, I don't recommend anybody tries to go down that route. You won't get a sensible answer from HMRC. They won't tell you where your tax money is going, and they will tell you that you have to pay it. Once you've started interacting with them as well, you're in for a lot of letters and a lot of follow-up calls. So rather than speak to your audience on things like, you know, doing things like that, I actually have started having conversations with people from the basis that, would you like to pay as little tax as possible legally? Because these are all things that we can do that reduce the amount of money that is paid to central government. And it also reduces the tax burden on ourselves, and it makes our life a little bit easier, but we can do it. You don't have to go as far as I have. I've literally shut down. One of the reasons that I won't be practicing anymore is because I've decided that I'm only ever going to earn up to the personal allowance in this country. I can afford to do that because, you know, of the position I'm in. I'm not suggesting everybody can, but if you can, then that's one way to do it, because I won't be paying income tax if I don't earn more than £12,570. But I have conversations with people now on the basis that would you like to arrange your affairs so that you pay as little tax as possible? And there are all sorts of very simple things that you can do. Okay. My job as a lawyer, part of my job was advising people on asset and wealth protection and taxation issues. And there's all sorts of things. So first of all, and you can take these or leave them, okay? It depends where you are and what you think about the system. So I'm not suggesting that, I'm not a financial advisor neither. So, you know, please take your own advice on this. The obvious ones are, of course, that you shouldn't be paying interest on money that you have in the bank. So you should make use of ISAs where you can. Like I said, take it or leave it. People might not want their money in the bank. I understand that, because they might have certain views about that, and that's absolutely fine. But if you have got money in the bank, then consider putting it into an ISA so that you don't pay tax on the interest. You can have 20,000 a year in there. There are also other investment products, investment bonds, for instance, where it's a return of capital and not interest. You can take a 5% withdrawal. You do not pay income tax on it. You could also consider sharing your allowances if you're married with your spouse and arranging things like that so you're both making use of your personal allowances, paying the least amount of tax possible. You should have a look at the inheritance tax connected to your estate and rearrange your affairs in. I could wax lyrical about this. I'm looking at the time and can see that probably we haven't got much longer left. But I can always come back and talk about in more practical terms the very easy things that people can do to minimize the amount of tax they are paying. And they can do that from a conscience base of saying, I'm doing this because I don't want to fund certain things. Okay. I think it will come to a point, however, where people will say, I'm going to actually stop paying my council tax en masse, which again could cause all sorts of problems. But if enough people do it, the system simply cannot cope. And I've got a lot to say about council tax anyway, but that's for another time.
Well, just give us a brief insight then on the council tax. You can't leave us hanging like that. Yeah, just an intro.
Well, in my personal opinion, this is part of the weaponisation of law, you see. Council tax non-payment, or if you're unable to pay your council tax, you're a criminal and you get sent to prison. Now, given that, I have a lot to say about the prosecutions for non-payment of council tax, which is I believe they are private criminal prosecutions, and they do not follow the criminal procedure rules in any way, shape, or form. I think they're probably out of jurisdiction. I would love to have the money to be able to take a case and get a declaratory judgment. I don't think it would ever be allowed to be made public or fly because of the political storm that it would open. But yes, I do. My opener on council tax prosecutions themselves would be that I think that they're private criminal prosecutions. I don't think that these summons that are issued are I think they're treated as an administrative process rather than a judicial one. And I think there's a case that we could have a look at some point in the future where we could explore that in more detail.
Excellent. Well, I think that will be something to look forward to. And again, we just, it was very helpful to hear exactly what you had to say. And I think people should bear in mind, your caveat, but to consider that there are things that people can do that are completely, I don't know if legitimate's quite the right word, because I think here what we're really looking for is morality. And that's the angle that you're coming from, or indeed sort of what is correct. Now, that is obviously for you something that's ongoing. Have you in the pipeline sort of a project of sorts that you're working towards, or anything in your future that would be something you'd be willing to talk about a bit?
Actually, several months ago, I started working with another girl on looking at the taxation system and going into a lot more detail, other than what I briefly said to you about how you can arrange things more tax efficiently, and then looking historically at more at forms of tax resistance. Unfortunately, that kind of got put on hold because I woke up in my usual fashion one day and just said, I can't do this job anymore. I'm going to close down my law firm. And I've then spent the last 3 months doing that. But come sort of end of September, beginning of October, I've got a lot more time on my hands, and I will be starting a Substack. And one of the things that I will be covering in that is this particular area of taxation, the relevant legislation, what it says, the history of tax resistance, the simple things that people can do to minimise the tax that they're paying, and all sorts of other things as well. there's a lot of work's gone into it already, but it's been put on the back burner simply because of where I've been in my professional and personal life, unfortunately, over the last few months.
Perfectly understandable, Claire. And I think that would be a very fitting place to end, something to dangle in front of people to look forward to. I think there'll be a huge chunk of the audience be going for that sort of information when you start to put it out. But in the meantime, where can people find what you are doing and what your thoughts are? Where can we sort of connect with you, as it were?
Unfortunately, I do not do much social media after what happened to me in 2020. I got absolutely trolled by the 77th Brigade. So did my business, took a hit. So mainly we would post what we think is interesting, often a lot of ranting on our Telegram channel. It is made up of lawyers, some of whom are actually ex-policemen as well, and it is called Lawyers of Light. However, having left or being due to leave the legal profession, I am open to any suggestions for new names because I won't be classing myself as a lawyer anymore.
Excellent. Fair enough. Thank you very much. Now, we're going to sort of wind it up there, but what I should remind people is that there'll be notes and links from this interview posted at ukcolumn.org. If you are in a financial position to support us and you're not already doing so, then I would encourage you to join for £5 a month, because it helps us to be able to bring interviews of this quality to you. So finally, it just remains for me to thank Claire very, very much indeed for an amazing voyage of insight. And we will really look forward to seeing you again in the future. So please keep in touch, and thank you very much, Claire.
You are welcome. It's been my absolute pleasure. Thank you, Charles.